Well, this weekend we were continuing our sermon series on the greatest teachings of Jesus, and we got to the Great Commission of Matthew chapter 28. And it's important in knowing as we lead up to the Great Commission, which comes at the end of Matthew chapter 28, what was happening early on in chapter 28. And from the very beginning of Matthew 28, we get this tale of two stories, so to speak. So about 2,000 years ago, in the city of Jerusalem, you have a stir on a Sunday morning because this guy that had been crucified by the Romans, who had been kind of put on trial by his own religious people, he had been put into a tomb, a borrowed tomb, a tomb from a wealthy landowner in town, and he had said that he was going to come back from the dead. And of course, we're talking about Jesus. Jesus had said that he was going to come back from the dead after 3 days. And so this was the third day. This was the morning of the third day. And at the very beginning of this Matthew chapter 28, you have a group of women who are going to Jesus's tomb. They go to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, where Jesus had been laid to rest, because the guys that had taken him down from the cross and had kind of anointed him for burial probably had done a rush job because they were trying to manage the Sabbath expectations. And so these ladies that had been followers of Jesus were going to maybe re-anoint and kind of finish the burial job. But when they get to the tomb, it says that an angel comes down from heaven and rolls the stone away. And it says that the guards that had been placed at the tomb, because this was, Jesus had been crucified kind of for a political reason. So there were guards posted in front of his tomb. These guards fell in fear at the presence of the angels. And the angels come and they speak to the women. They say, "Don't be afraid. Come in and see that his body's not here. Jesus has risen just like he said he was going to do. And now you can go tell his disciples to meet him at Galilee. He's going to be in Galilee and he wants to meet with them there." And so the women, it says, they take off and they're filled with great joy and great fear. And then as they're leaving this space of the tomb, they hear greetings and they look and there's Jesus, and he appears to them. It says they fall at his feet and they worship him. And he says the same thing. He says, "Go and tell my disciples that I'll meet with them in Galilee." And then Matthew tells us a little bit of a different story, because at that same space, outside that same tomb, those guards that had been posted there, they had fallen in fear when the angel came. And so now they have to figure out what to do with this story of the empty tomb, with this fact of the empty tomb. And they go and they start talking to the priest that had been a part of trying Jesus and handing him over to the Romans to be killed. And so the priests, those guys with their interests in mind, they say, "You know what? We can't have this story circulating. And so we want you to tell people that his disciples came and that they stole the body at night." And this would have been risky for those guards, because they're guards. Their whole job is predicated on protecting what they're supposed to protect. And obviously, if they tell people that the body was stolen, then they will have not had done their job. And so the priests say, "Oh, don't worry about it. The same way that we kind of worked with the government officials to take care of this guy in the first place, we'll make sure that you guys don't get in any trouble." And the scripture goes on to say in verse 15 that the story of the disciples stealing the body has circulated amongst people all the way up until this day. And so what we have in Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 15, is really the tale of two stories. Did Jesus rise from the dead? One story says that it's great news. He has risen. The other story says that it's fake news. It says that the disciples came and stole his body. So which is it? The resurrection is either great news or it's fake news. And that's something that we all have to wrestle with, that we all have to come to terms with. Nobody disputes that the tomb was empty. But there are multiple stories as to why and how that tomb became empty. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, he said that if Jesus hasn't raised from the dead, if this is just fake news, then everything we do is in vain. All that we believe is in vain. All the preaching, all the starting of churches, all the gathering, all the worshiping, all of that stuff is in vain if Jesus hasn't raised from the dead. If it's fake news, then everything we do as Christians is futile. He's like, but if it's not, then it's the most important thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. If it's true that Jesus rose from the dead, that is great news for you and me, because that means death doesn't have the final word. A mathematician and logician named Blaise Pascal, he came up with what's been kind of coined now as Pascal's wager. And the question really kind of comes down to whether this is great news or fake news. And Pascal says, if it's great news, and if you live your life as though resurrection is real, if you live your life with the hope of heaven, if you follow after Jesus, if you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and if you love everybody all the time, he goes, at the end of your life, if you die and it's not real, what have you lost? What have you lost? On the flip side, if you think it's fake news and you live your life selfishly, if you live your life according to your own principles and kind of paradigms, and you get to the end and you find out that it is real, what have you lost? And Pascal says it's your wager to make. Which are you going to wager your life on? Is it real? Is it true? Is it great news? Or is it fake news? If it's fake news, it's been pretty damaging and maybe even deceptive. But if it's great news, then it established the greatest movement that the world has ever seen. I happen to believe that the church globally and the church historically, that the church is the greatest movement that the world has ever known. I believe this, to the core of my being, that the church is the most diverse, equitable, and inclusive space on the planet. There is not another organization that is as wide-reaching as the church. There is not another organization that is as historic as the church. There's not another organization that has as strong of a movement. If you look at all the principles of a strong movement, that a movement offers identity. I see that in Matthew chapter 28. If a movement offers a sense of belonging, then we see that within the church that gets started in Matthew chapter 28. And if a movement is supposed to offer us purpose with our lives, then there's no greater cause than the cause that the church has put in front of us to live every day and to love everyone the way that Jesus does. And this is how Jesus summarizes it in Matthew chapter 28. Verses 18 to 20, he says that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Jesus started the greatest movement that the world has ever seen. All the movement principles of identity, belonging, and purpose are present within the church. And so I think it's just kind of fun to think sometimes about Jesus as a founder, as a CEO. And if you think about what would Jesus have on his vision board, or what would be posted in the walls of the office if Jesus was the CEO. And I think you could look at like Matthew chapter 16, and you could see when Jesus was gathered with his close company of followers, and they were at Caesarea Philippi, and he said, they had come to confess. Peter had stepped forward and said, Jesus, we believe that you're the Messiah. We believe that you are the Christ. And Jesus said, yes, I'm going to establish my church. I'm going to build not a building, not a group of people, not a tribe. I'm going to build a global enterprise, an organization, a gathering beyond what you guys could even imagine or dream. I will establish my church. I think that would be kind of the vision board moment with Jesus as CEO, that he is building a gathering. He is building an eternal family of nations. And he would do these little company offsites. Maybe Caesarea Philippi was one of those, but he would take his close company of companions and he would send them out. In fact, we think of these guys as apostles. We think of these people as apostles, but apostle, the noun is a bit misleading. What apostleship really is a verb. It's to be sent somewhere. And we have examples in Mark chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 10 and Luke chapter 9 of Jesus taking kind of that close company of his disciples and sending them into the places where he himself was about to go and preach and teach. And so it was almost like as kind of, company offsites go, this was kind of like a chance to go out and practice what they would be doing eventually after Jesus was gone. And in Luke chapter 10, we see that Jesus included as many as 72 people in one of these kind of off-site experiences, one of these short-term mission trips, so to speak. And so Jesus, as a founder and CEO, he has a compelling vision board. He would do these little kind of company off-sites where people could practice what they would be commissioned into. And then in Matthew chapter 28, like I said, we have kind of his mountaintop keynote. He comes into the fullness of his glory, his resurrected state, and he meets with his companions, his disciples, on this mountaintop. And he tells them in the midst of that all authority on heaven and earth has been given to him. And you have to think about it, like, if he really had raised from the dead, then he really does have all authority. The political leaders try to squelch him. The religious leaders try to squelch him. I mean, if you really just stop and think about it, like, we measure time based on the life of Jesus. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to him. By the time he commissioned this group of people to go into all the nations, they had seen what we call now good news, great news. They had seen him conquer death. And when I think about it, I think these are people, men and women, who probably had never been outside of that small geographical area of the world. Like they probably had never been outside of Israel, maybe as far south as Egypt, but most of them would have been highly local. They just didn't have the same means of travel that we have today. To get on a boat and to go across the Mediterranean Sea was like literally to them to enter into chaos where you may fall off of the end of the world if a storm blows you in the wrong direction. And so they lived most of their lives hyper localized. But in this mountaintop keynote in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus says, you guys are going to go into all the nations. And you're going to help people identify with me. You're going to share this sense of belonging that we have with one another. And the purpose for which we live will be to help people experience full life and real love. I mean, just think for a second about the Apostle Peter. And we talk about this sometimes around City Coast. Like, what if the Apostle Peter could just walk in and catch us one day having church? How mind-blowing would it be for this fisherman from Galilee to see that 2,000 years later, people on a continent that he may not have known even existed are opening up a book that has his name in it. And we're reading about his life. I mean, contrast that with Caesar. If Jesus really has all authority, maybe we should just contrast it with Caesar, because Caesar was kind of like the guy in the first century. Like Caesar is the name above all names, if people are being honest. Caesars are kind of like demigods. You have Julius Caesar, and then you have Augustus Caesar. You have this idea of a Pax Romana, that there's Roman peace, that the world is being saved by Rome. So Caesar is pretty elevated, right? If you just take the name of Caesar today, what do you think about? Salad? Casinos? Pizza? Somewhere near the city of Rome, there's a space that we know as the Vatican. And within Vatican City, one of the most beautiful, most artistic, and architecturally magnificent buildings of the world exists in Rome. That building is called St. Peter's Basilica. It's named after the fisherman from Galilee. When you think about how the kingdom of God is turning the world upside down, there's a building in the Vatican named after Peter. When we think about Caesar, we think about salad. How crazy is that? These people, these early followers of Jesus, the women who met the angel at the tomb and who came to see Jesus and who went to tell the story of Jesus, the disciples, the apostles, guys like Peter, they crushed it. And maybe more specifically, they were crushed by it. They gave their lives for the movement. They believed wholeheartedly that it was great news and that the whole world needed to hear it. And in many ways, City Coast is the fruit of their faithfulness. We don't exist if they had gotten scared. We don't do what we're doing if they were too afraid. And that's what we see in Matthew chapter 28 in verses 5 and 6. The angel says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to come and seek. Don't be afraid to come in and view the empty tomb. And Jesus says, don't be afraid to go and tell. Don't be afraid to go and share what you've seen in this space. And then we see it again in Matthew chapter 28, verses 9 and 10, where Jesus is saying, don't be afraid to come and check this out. Come and experience the great news. And don't be afraid to go and talk about it. Don't be afraid to go and tell what you've seen and heard. In fact, we think of it as a great commission, but I think it might be better suited as an everyday commission. Every day, when you look at that very last part of Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, if you want to get into some of the Greek and stuff, the idea of going, it's really a present participle. It's the idea of as you're going, everywhere you go, every day you go, as you're going, know that Jesus is with you. Jesus is with you, that he jumped out of heaven in order to be with us in the midst of this movement. The whole of every moment until the very end of the age. As you go, know that God is with us the whole of every moment. Everything is sacred. You don't have to cross countries and go across seas or go far reaches of the world. Every single moment, God is with us. It's an everyday commission, and it's the greatest cause, the greatest movement any of us have ever seen. That's kind of the big idea from this week, that the greatest news established the greatest movement.